Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This is BBC News.
We're going to go straight to Peterborough because Jeremy Corbyn's just gone to the podium. Let's join him.
Thank you for coming. And Sam, thank you very much for that introduction. And if I may, on behalf of millions of very grateful people, say thank you to you as an NHS worker and all your colleagues for keeping us safe and keeping us healthy in our National Health Service. Thank you for everything that you do. And as a fellow member of Unison, thank you for chairing today's meeting. Could I also thank all of you for coming and thank Mohammed Jamil, the leader of the Labour Group on Peterborough Council, for being here today. Mohammed, lovely to see you here. Thank you for coming along today. To Alex Mayer, newly appointed MEP for this region. It's not the easiest time to take on being a member of the European Parliament, but well done you, and we look forward to working with you in your endeavours there. And to my old friend Lisa Forbes, the former parliamentary candidate for Peterborough, thanks for everything you do all the time, 24/7, for everybody in all your activity. Lisa, thank you so much. And this meeting is been called at short notice here in Peterborough so that we'd have a chance to say something about the current situation facing the government in this country and how we deal with Brexit negotiations. So whether you voted to leave or remain, everybody voted for a better future for this country. But one thing is very clear, the Tories cannot deliver that. So what I want to do today is try and set out how a Labour Britain would be different and what vision we would put forward for it. The government is in disarray over Brexit. The Prime Minister herself has made it clear they didn't have a plan before the referendum and they still don't have a plan now. I did draw this matter to her attention one time in Prime Minister's question time, but she still doesn't seem to have got the joke that I made at the time, but it's work in progress. I personally voted to remain and reform in the European Union, as I'm sure many did in this room. I'm not uncritical of the European Union. I wasn't them then, and I'm not now. It does have many failings, but we voted to hopefully to remain. That didn't come about. Some people have argued we should have a second referendum. The case was put to our party's membership last summer and defeated. It's quite clear Britain is now leaving the European Union, and we have to make sure that Britain is better off in the future. But that's far from inevitable, and it certainly won't happen with a government that stands by while wages and salaries are driven down, our industries are hollowed out, and our public services are cut to the point of breakdown. Because while the European Union has many problems, so does Britain in the hands of Theresa May and her Tory government after 6 years of Conservative misrule and the first 5 of those supported by the Liberal Democrats. Our social care system is failing to provide essential care for people with disabilities and over 1 million of our elderly people. The National Health Service is in record deficit with nearly 4 million people on waiting lists. The Red Cross is describing the state of our emergency health and social care as a humanitarian crisis. Just reflect on that for a moment. A respected organisation like the Red Cross describes it as a humanitarian crisis. That surely is a wake-up call to everybody. Our jobs market is being turned into a sea of insecurity. 6 million workers in Britain earning less than the living wage, nearly 1 million people on 0 hours contracts, record numbers of people in work living in poverty. Whilst in Fat Cat Britain, the chief executives have already received more than most people will earn all year by the 3rd day in January. My point is this: I don't trust this government with social care, or the National Health Service, or the labour market. So, do I trust them to make a success of the Brexit negotiations? Not remotely. Only a Labour government determined to reshape the economy so that it works for all in every part of the country can make Brexit work for the people of this country. There can be no question of giving Theresa May's Tories a free pass in the Brexit negotiations, to entrench and take still further the failed free market policies in post-Brexit Britain. The Tory leavers, whose leaders are now in government, and their UKIP allies, had no more of a plan for a Brexit vote than the Tory Remainers like Theresa May. They did, however, promise that Brexit would guarantee funding for the National Health Service to the tune of £350 million a week. It must have been true because it was on the side of Boris Johnson's bus. That's before it was painted out, of course. What happened to that promise? Now the NHS and social care are in serious crisis. It's already been ditched. And it's not just on the NHS. We've had no answers from the government about any of the plans or objectives for these complex negotiations. At no point since the Second World War has Britain's ruling elite so recklessly put the country in such an exposed position without any plan. As a result, they're now reduced to repeating, Brexit means Brexit. They're unfit to negotiate it. That is why Labour has demanded the government come to Parliament and set out their plan before they present it to the EU in Brussels and explain what they want to achieve for this country. But in the glaring absence of a government plan, Labour also believes it's time to spell out more clearly what we believe the country's Brexit objectives should be. People voted on the promise that Britain outside the European Union would be a better place for all its citizens, whatever their colour or creed. A chance to regain control over our economy, our democracy and people's lives. But beyond very vague plans on border controls, the only concrete commitments the government has so far made is to protect the financial interests in the City of London. Though maybe that's hardly surprising from a government that has already slashed the bank levy and continues to reduce corporation tax. In the last budget, there was not a penny extra for the NHS or social care. But under the Tories, there's always billions available for giveaways to the very richest. As far as Labour is concerned, the referendum result delivered a very clear message. First, that Britain must leave the EU and bring control of our democracy and our economy closer to home. Second, that people would get the resources they were promised to rebuild the National Health Service. Third, that people have had their fill of an economic system and an establishment that works only for the few, not for the many. And finally, their concerns about immigration policy would be addressed. Labour accepts those challenges that the voters have given us. Unlike the Tories, we will insist on a Brexit that works, not just for city interests, but in the interests of all. That puts health and social care, decent jobs and living standards first, and a better deal for young people and the areas of this country that have been left behind for far too long. First, we will open the way to rebuilding our National Health Service by ending the underfunding and privatisation of healthcare. Leaving the EU won't free up the £350 million a week that Boris Johnson claimed, but savings could be a help in closing that gap. And we will absolutely reject pressure to privatise public services as part of any settlement, just as we oppose the attempt to give special legal privileges to corporate interests as part of the European Union's Canadian-European trade arrangements or the transatlantic trade and investment partnership deals that are being negotiated at the present time. The government could have given the National Health Service the funding it needs, but it chose not to. Their tax giveaways and to big business hand back £70 billion between now and 2022. That is more of a priority to the Tories than elderly people neglected in their homes, patients dying on trolleys, or millions waiting in pain to get the treatment they need. Labour, us, we created the National Health Service, and it's only safe under a Labour government. We're absolutely clear about that. We will give the NHS the funding it needs. The British people voted to refinance the NHS, and we will deliver it. Second, we will push to maintain full access to the European market to protect living standards and jobs. But we will also press to repatriate powers from Brussels so the British government can develop a genuine industrial strategy essential to the economy of the future so that no community is left behind. Tory governments have hidden behind EU state aid rules because they don't want to intervene. They did so again last year when the steel industry was in trouble and Redcar was closed. Other governments in Europe acted and saved their industry. The Tory government here just sat back. But EU rules can also be a block on the action that's needed to support our economy, decent jobs and living standards. We will use state aid powers in a drive to build a new economy based on new technology and green industries of the future. That's why Labour has set out proposals for a national investment bank with regional investment banks that will decide the priorities of their areas. A massive programme of investment that will be needed to rebuild regional economies. This country, I'm sure you would all agree, is far too centralised, so we'll take back powers over regional policy. And instead of such decisions being made in Brussels or in London, we'll make sure they're taken locally wherever possible. Taking back real control and putting power and resources right into the heart of local communities to target investment where it's needed. Third, we will use the huge spending leverage of taxpayer-funded services to massively expand the number of proper, good quality apprenticeships. All firms with a government or council contract over £250,000 will be required to pay tax in the UK and to train young people. No company will receive taxpayer-funded contracts if it or its parent company is headquartered in a tax haven. And we will not buy outsourced public services, such as care for the elderly, from companies whose owners and executives are creaming off profits to stuff their pockets at the expense of the workforce and the public purse. Finally, we would take back control over our jobs market, which has been so seriously damaged by years of reckless deregulation. During the referendum campaign, many people expressed deep concern about unregulated migration from the EU. In many sectors of the economy, from IT to health and social care, migrant workers make a vital and very important contribution to our common prosperity. And in many parts of the country, public services depend on migrant labour that's come here to work for the good of all of us. This government has been saying it will reduce migration to tens of thousands. Theresa May, as Home Secretary, set an arbitrary target, knowing full well it would not be met. They inflamed the issue of immigration, they put immense strain on public services with 6 years of extreme cuts, and then blame migrants for the pressure caused by Tory austerity in the first place. And last week, a government minister who voted leave told an employers' conference, "Don't worry, we'll still let you bring in cheap EU labour." Unlike the Tories, we won't offer any false promises or sow division by scapegoating migrants, because we know where that leads to. The worrying and, to me, frightening rise in race hate crime and division in recent months, and how the issue of immigration can be used as a proxy to abuse or intimidate minority communities within our society. We're not wedded to free movement to the EU as a point of principle, but I don't want to be misinterpreted, nor do we rule it out. When it comes to border controls, we're proud to say we'll meet our international obligations for refugees and fleeing from wars and persecution and seeking a place of safety. To those EU citizens who are already here, we will guarantee your rights, and indeed we put a motion to that effect to Parliament in July. And we continue to welcome international students who come to this country just as much as we welcome the opportunities of students from this country to study in European universities. We cannot afford to lose full access to European markets on which so many British businesses and jobs depend. Changes to the way migration rules operate from the EU will obviously be part of the negotiations. We support fair rules and management of migration as part of a deal, while putting jobs and living standards first in the negotiations. But at the same time, taking action against undercutting of pay and conditions, closing down cheap labour loopholes, banning exclusive advertising of jobs abroad, and strengthening workplace protections would have the effect probably of reducing numbers in the most deregulated sectors, regardless of the final deal. Of course, where migration has put a strain on public services, we would restore the Migrant Impact Fund to support local government and local services. Sarah Champion is leading for Labour on our policies to ensure better integration and more community cohesion. As part of that, again, will be about restoring funding for English language lessons. Let's not forget, it was this Tory government that slashed funding for learning English as a second language. We've seen the Prime Minister talking about the need to strengthen mental health care while cutting funding by 8%. It seems the government's second language is actually hypocrisy. It's the ripping up of workplace protections and trade union rights that has allowed unscrupulous employers to exploit both migrant and British labour to help keep down pay and conditions and drive them even lower for everyone. But let's be clear, public services are not under pressure because of immigration, especially since many migrant workers keep those public services going. They're under pressure because this Tory government has cut them to the bone in order to fund tax breaks and tax breaks again for the super rich and very big businesses. That's the game the Tories play. Low taxes for the rich, low pay for the rest, underfunded public services, and find someone to blame. It's brutal and it's not working. We will break this failed model and offer solutions to the problems, not someone to blame. We'll demand that these negotiations give us the power to intervene decisively to prevent workers from here or abroad being used and exploited to undermine pay and conditions at work. We need a drive to provide people with the skills necessary to take up the new jobs which a Labour government will generate. I've already set out to both the CBI and TUC conferences. This means asking companies to pay a bit more in tax to fund more and better access to education and skills training. And government contractors always providing decent, skilled apprenticeships for the next generation. We will end the race to the bottom in pay, working conditions and jobs, insecurity by setting up a new Ministry of Labour to get a grip on the anything that goes job market free for all. We will ensure that all workers have equal rights at work from day one and require collective bargaining agreements in key sectors in a properly regulated labour market so that workers cannot be undercut. This will bring an end to the unscrupulous use of agency labour and bogus self-employment, to stop undercutting and ensure every worker has a secure job with secure pay. That's why we'll set the minimum wage level at the living wage, expected to be £10 an hour by 2020. These changes should be made to benefit the whole community. But while we tackle low pay at the bottom, we also have to address the excess that drives that poverty pay, that leaves millions of people in poverty even though they're in work. In the 1920s, J.P. Morgan, the Wall Street banker, yes, J.P. Morgan, the Wall Street banker, limited salaries to 20 times that of junior employees. Another advocate of pay ratios was David Cameron. His government proposed a 20-to-1 pay ratio to limit sky-high pay in the public sector. And now all salaries higher than $150,000 must be signed off by the Cabinet Office. We'll go further and extend that to any company that is awarded a government contract. A 20-to-1 ratio means someone earning the living wage, just over $16,000 a year, would permit an executive to be earning nearly $350,000. It cannot be right that if companies are getting public money, that they can be creamed off by a few at the top. But there is a wider point too. 20 years ago, the top bosses of the Financial Times Stock Exchange 100 Companies Index earn just 50 times the average worker. Today, that figure is 130 times. Last year alone, the top bosses got a 10% pay rise, far higher than those doing the work in the shops, the call centres and the warehouses, or indeed than many health workers who got no rise whatsoever last year or for many other years. So what can we do? These are alternatives. We could allow consumers to judge for themselves with a government-backed kite mark for those companies that have agreed pay ratios between the pay of the highest and the lowest earners with a recognised trade union. We could ask for executive pay to be signed off by remuneration committees on which workers have a majority. We could ensure higher earners pay their fair share by introducing a higher rate of income tax on the highest 5% or 1% of incomes. We could offer lower rates of corporation tax for companies that don't pay anyone more than a certain multiple of the pay of the lowest. There are many options, but what we cannot accept is a society in which a few earn in 2 days and a bit what a nurse, a shop worker or a teacher does in a year. It simply cannot be right. This is not about limiting aspiration or penalising success. It's about recognising that success is a collective effort and rewards must be shared. No company survives on its own. It's a collective endeavour of all of its workers. We cannot have the CEO paying less tax than the cleaner and pretending they're worth thousands times more than the lowest paid staff. So this is Labour's vision for Britain after leaving the European Union. We're not going to block the referendum vote when the time comes in Parliament to ensure Article 50 goes into operation, but as the opposition, we will ensure the government is held to account for its negotiating demands. At the moment, they're in total disarray on Brexit, on the NHS and social care, on the pay in your pocket. Labour will build a better Britain out of Brexit. That will start with refinancing of the National Health Service and the creation of a more equal country in which power and wealth is more fairly shared amongst our communities, a genuinely inclusive society with strong and peaceful relations with the rest of the world. This is Labour's New Year pledge to the British people, and I thank you for coming here to share that vision with me.
We believe that Jeremy Corbyn is going to be taking a few questions from the floor, so we were very keen to hear those. Let's see, just stay with us for a moment, see what is happening next. We were very much told that there could be as much as 20 minutes of questions, so let's see whether that is indeed the case.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Hi, Robert.
Hello, nice to see you. So a couple of questions. Theresa May has said that it's a primary Theresa May said it's a primary aim to take back control of immigration policy. Is that what a Labour government would want? And secondly, I'm slightly unclear. Do you want an absolute cap on top pay?
What I'm concerned about is the ratio levels, and we've set out a number on top pay, a number of alternatives here. And indeed, I was discussing this on the radio this morning. You could set a limit on top pay. I think it's probably better to look at the ratio issue, because that indeed would then encourage wage rises lower down and ensure a better sharing of the resources and the profits of any company or organisation.
Can I just be clear on that? If you're an entrepreneur and you set up a business that creates lots of employment and you sell your business for a lot of money, or your business is worth a lot of money, is that a bad thing?
It's a good thing if people set up a business and create a successful enterprise that creates a lot of jobs. That, of course, is a good thing. What we want to do is make sure that those jobs and those businesses remain here doing that work, because too often in Britain people do set up new businesses, have new ideas, new technical developments. Great. Unfortunately, our banks don't lend them the money, the capital they need to develop. Hedge funds buy them up and usually send the job somewhere else. What we want to do is develop a manufacturing economy in this country. So this fits in with what I'm saying about the National Investment Bank and the participation it will take part in industry.
And sorry, you didn't say, on immigration policy, do you want complete control over immigration policy?
Well, obviously, outside the European Union there is control, but quite clearly there also has to be a market access in Europe. About half of our trade is with the European Union. That is crucial. What I'm more concerned about is the way in which migrant workers have been grotesquely exploited, brought into this country to undercut wages and conditions. Look at the reports on Sport Direct, look at other companies and the reports on them. And so what we're doing is ensuring better working conditions for everybody.
Thank you. Andy Gibbon? Gary even.
We've been renamed.
You were clear-ish that you do not rule out sticking with freedom of movement. Would you rule out bringing in work visas for EU citizens?
We have to go into the negotiations. The crucial thing has to be to maintain the market access with Europe and take it from there. I'm concerned about the levels of undercutting, and indeed during the referendum campaign I said a great deal about the oddly named Posting of Workers Directive, which is an EU rule which has not yet been ratified by all member states, although Britain did eventually agree to ratify it, which would prevent agencies recruiting wholesaler workforce to be brought to somewhere, Britain say, in Western Europe, and used to take over an entire construction site and dismiss all the existing workers there and undercut their pay conditions. Imagine the effect that has on local community relations and everything else. So I'm concerned that as a priority to end the undercutting.
Would you rule out bringing in work visas for EU citizens?
Nothing is ruled out at this stage, but I want us to look at the access to those markets and access for an industrial development in the future. We might be leaving the European Union, but we still have to have a relationship with the rest of Europe.
Faisal?
Is there a country in the world where a high pay or maximum pay ratio has actually been enforced by the state? I think it was tried in Egypt and it hasn't been enforced. Cuba, perhaps?
We are looking at this as a consultation proposal, whether we could use it as in company law, whether we could use it in statutory law, or whether it's something that we could ensure is introduced voluntarily. But this massive gap, which is getting wider in Britain than almost any other country in the OECD, surely is a matter of concern. And I think it's something that is actually very popular. A lot of people are very interested in this idea because what they see is they're working really hard in an organisation or a company. You work really hard in your organisation and company. I think your CEO earns more than you do. Since you work for Sky, that must be the case.
Moving on.
But the point I'm making is that no organisation survives only on the brilliance of the chief executive or the chairman of the board. Every organisation requires its entire workforce. Listen, you couldn't run a hospital without doctors, nurses, cleaners and catering. You couldn't run a school without the whole team. You can't run a company without the whole team. So can't we look instead at reducing that gap to ensure a better standard of living for everybody? It doesn't remove aspiration. It doesn't remove opportunities for growth. It just means it's a considerably fairer society than we're heading for at the present time.
I just must ask, you were quite critical of Boris Johnson's bus, but you appear now to have the same basic philosophy in saying that you can save EU contributions and deploy that to the NHS. It's just a matter of the amount.
No, what I'm saying is that there's going to be a reconfiguration of expenditure. There are key areas of our society. The most important to me at the moment is the National Health Service. Look at the crisis it's in at the present time. Look at the funding it needs. But there's also the question of taking up the capital investment programme of the EU in particular regions of this country, particularly the southwest, for example. And so we are going to guarantee those as well. But I see it as a priority to fund the NHS. Thank you very much.
I think we've run out of time, or okay. I'm sorry, everybody, we've run out of time. But thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Well, that would appear to be the end of the Q&A session. Let's go straight to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, because she was listening to that speech there by the Labour leader in Peterborough. And, of course, so many questions, I think, really, that people wanted answered, Vicky, after Jeremy Corbyn was talking on BBC Radio this morning. We suddenly found out about a potential pay cap, and yet then other members of the Labour Party seemed either not to agree or not to know much about that. So we were hoping to get to the bottom of what he really wanted, what the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, really wants in terms of a pay cap. You heard him there during the Q&A saying, "I want a fairer society." That is a key refrain that we keep hearing. I think we can talk to Vicky Young. Vicky, in terms of that pay cap issue, are we any clearer as to what exactly Jeremy Corbyn is driving at now?
No, I don't think on the detail. I mean, this is something he raised when he went through the leadership contest in 2015. It was raised again today, quite unexpectedly, I think, and there doesn't seem to have been the detailed work maybe done on it. And what he's just done in that speech is clarify slightly. He seemed to give the impression earlier he was talking about a salary cap. Now he's sort of offering different alternatives that there could be and talking more about ratios. So what he's saying is that within a company, the chief executive or the top of that company should not earn more than, say, 20 times what a junior member on the minimum wage might be earning. And he says that would mean if the lowest paid person's on £16,000 a year, the top executive could earn up to £350,000. And he's now saying it wouldn't be across all companies, but maybe that for those who have got government contracts, they would impose that. Now, earlier, the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, talked about this and said that that would be the best way of doing it, maybe incentivising companies through the tax system, saying you can pay less in corporation tax, for example, if you sign up to some kind of salary cap. Now, clearly, other members of the Shadow Cabinet didn't really know this was coming. They have said that it's not party policy at the moment. It is, though, clearly something that Jeremy Corbyn thinks is important. He's talked a lot about fairness. We've heard Theresa May talking about this, saying that resentment builds up, that there's a divided nation to some extent. Jeremy Corbyn is trying to come up with a policy to do something about it rather than just talk about it.
And a thought as well, Vicky, about the immigration question, about what Britain might look like once we are no longer part of the EU. Again, seemed to be a degree of confusion earlier in the day. What more are we hearing about that?
Yeah, well, his point is that he feels that the government has no plan on all of this. Now, of course, within his own party, there have been a difference of opinion, particularly about levels of immigration. He has always said that he doesn't think immigration is too high in this country, and it's clear from what he said today that he stands by all of that. Now, earlier he talked about the fact that Labour would not be wedded to freedom of movement. Just now, though, he said that he doesn't want to rule that out. So I think there is still some clarification needed there on exactly what he feels about all of this, whether he was suggesting that he does think that Britain should remain within the single market, for example, but that of course would probably mean accepting freedom of movement. So it's unclear. I think there are certain pressures in the Labour Party in all of this. There are many Labour MPs, particularly in the north of England, who feel they're under pressure from UKIP. They feel that they're not reflecting the anxieties of many Labour voters too, who feel that immigration is too high. It sounded earlier as if Jeremy Corbyn wanted to address that, but it is very clear what he believes. He is making the positive case for immigration.
Vicky, thanks very much for now. More from you a little later. We'll talk specifically now about that whole issue of executive pay. I'm joined via webcam by David Blanchflower, an economic advisor at one stage to Jeremy Corbyn. You'll know, of course, a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. He joins us from the United States. Good afternoon.
Hello, good to talk to you.
Well, we don't seem to have too many more specific details to give you following on from Jeremy Corbyn's speech that's just finished. But in terms of what you know he's been saying on the radio today, the notion of some sort of cap on pay, certainly because he wants to make society fairer. We've heard that a lot in the last half an hour. Is there any way in which that could potentially work?
Absolutely not. it's obviously sensible to think about what you might do about inequality. That's obviously an issue, and there's a question of fairness about who get paid what. But the reality is there is a market. To put it technically, there's a productivity distribution, and that has widened over time. So the very best are more productive than the person at the middle. And the reason that incomes have broadened is that people are paid for their performance. And obviously that's part of the story here. And clearly in an economy like the UK's, you want to reward somebody who invests, let's say hires thousands and thousands of people. The country benefits because of the jobs. The country benefits because of the extra tax income. And to actually think you could impose a salary cap is a completely idiotic idea. Not a single economist would agree with it. And if I'd have been an advisor when he didn't used to talk to me anyway, I would have said to him, back off, which it appears that he did within a couple of hours, because there was a visceral reaction from everybody on the idea that you'd put a salary cap on, because firms can find ways around it. It would be a disincentive. If you cap salaries in the public sector, quality falls. So this is another silly idea.
Could there be, I mean, he kept using the word fair and fairness in the course of that speech. Could there be a way then of looking at ratios, though, somehow either incentivising or penalising companies if there is too big a gap between the person at the top and the person at the bottom? Is there a way there?
Well, the question is, what's too big a gap? I mean, a company, let's say, is created by an owner who created the job and created jobs for everybody else. It's absolutely unworkable. Think about a company who then simply creates another company and pays through that. It's completely unworkable and impractical because we have markets. And the UK economy is a capitalist economy. It's completely impossible to do that. So company A says, okay, I'll create something, another shell company, and I'll pay the director £1. I mean, it's just completely impossible and impractical. There is a fairness question, but maybe the way to do it in a company is to incentivize shareholders, give them more power. But if the shareholders see that their return is okay, they go along with it. So you could certainly do that, but to actually say we should cap pay, I mean, it's not practical. It's not that you don't want to do anything about inequality, but this isn't the way to do it. Completely impractical. I mean, I tweeted this morning. I think it's totally lunatic.
OK, well, if you were still advising him today, assuming he did, to quote your phrase, assuming he did listen to you, what advice would you be giving him? What would you say, look, this is how we can deal with inequality in this country?
Well, I think my friend Richard Murphy, who was also an advisor, has said that he thought that the scheme, that the ideas that Corbyn had suggested were impractical. There are things that you can do through the tax system. You can give incentives for firms to hire. You give increasing power to the shareholders. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's talked about making remuneration committees where the majority of people on there are the workers. Well, do you think shareholders are going to agree with that? No. So that shows no understanding of the way capitalism works. You can talk to companies. I mean, the government is doing that, thinking about ways of being fair and sharing things around. Let's just understand, though, workers are paid more in companies that are profitable. So profits are good for everybody. Corbyn doesn't seem to actually understand that. My students all think, I'm going to go work in certain sectors where my pay is going to be highest. And those are the sectors where profits are highest. The danger is what Corbyn talks about. It lowers the incentive to invest and it lowers profits. So I don't think it's a start.
OK, as a quick final thought then, could he or should he be doing more at the bottom end of the scale then? Should he, in your opinion, be talking more about 0 hours contracts, people who have a job, have multiple jobs sometimes, but still barely make enough to pay the rent because they just don't have the security of tenure, they don't have the right pay and benefits? Is that the sort of thing he should be going on?
Well, certainly trying to help people at the low end has a positive to it. Dealing through the welfare system, I mean, the cuts to welfare, the way that the poor have been impacted, you could clearly reverse those. You could think about ways of incentivising firms to hire people and to help them to have a basic wage. So give incentives to firms to do the right thing. My experience when you talk to firms is that they'll actually cooperate with you and think about ways of improving things. So they see incentives in some sense, give workers better conditions, give them better pay conditions, and actually their productivity rises. So the reality is in the labour market, you want to try and encourage productivity and reward productivity, not take the rewards away.
David Blanchflower, very good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us there from the US.
Thank you.
I've been getting away with it all